The 3-meter alien's laughter shook the hall as he stared at the ancient blade. Humanity sends a child with Grandpa's letter opener? This rusty knife will pierce military-grade nano-armor? He didn't know that folded steel remembers everything, and 13-year-old Aaron was about to shut his damn mouth. The forge sang its ancient song in the dying light of Hymar's twin suns. Metal against metal, fire against steel, the rhythm of creation beating like a second heartbeat through the cramped workshop. Aaron Weir stood in the doorway, his 13-year-old frame casting a long shadow across the packed earth floor, watching his grandfather's gnarled hands shape molten steel into something that transcended mere function. The old man's face, a landscape of wrinkles carved by 70 years of labor and loss, caught the orange glow of the furnace, transforming him into something almost mythical. Sweat ran in rivulets down his weathered cheeks, pooling in the deep lines around his mouth, but his hands never trembled, never hesitated, never showed the uncertainty that would have destroyed lesser craftsmen. "Every strike of the hammer is a piece of you, boy," the old man said, his voice rough as grinding stone, abraded by decades of breathing forge smoke and metal dust. "Every blade has a soul, whether the universe acknowledges it or not. This isn't just a weapon you're watching me create. It's a reflection of who you are and what you're willing to sacrifice. It's the sum total of everything I know, everything my father knew, everything his father knew before him, all the way back to Earth itself." Aaron absorbed these words like parched earth absorbing the first rain after a drought, feeling them settle into his bones with a weight that had nothing to do with their simplicity and everything to do with their truth. The workshop smelled of hot metal and leather and coal smoke, but underneath those immediate scents lay something deeper, the accumulated odor of history itself, of generations of craftsmen who had stood in this same space, breathing this same air, shaping this same steel. Tools hung on wooden walls that had been transported from Earth decades ago when humanity first staggered into the stars, desperate and scattered like seeds blown before a storm. Each tool told a story if you knew how to listen. The hammer his great-great-grandfather had used to forge the first blade on an alien world, the tongs that had shaped weapons and implements for 5 generations, the grinding wheel that had outlasted 3 colony relocations and countless masters. Outside the workshop, Hymar's wind howled across rust-colored plains that stretched to the curved horizon, carrying particles of iron oxide that gave the planet its name and its perpetual blood-red appearance. The colony itself sprawled across a shallow valley like a wound in the landscape. Angular structures of prefabricated metal that leaked precious atmosphere through seals that never quite held. Hydroponic domes struggling against alien soil that rejected Earth crops with chemical hostility, and everywhere people who worked 16-hour days just to maintain the fragile equilibrium that kept them alive. Humanity's expansion into space had not been the glorious adventure that old vids from Earth had promised. It had been a scramble, a desperate flight from an Earth that could no longer sustain its billions, a mad rush to colonize any world that could theoretically support human life. Now scattered across dozens of marginal planets that barely tolerated their presence, humans clung to existence with fingernails and determination, and a stubborn refusal to admit that perhaps they didn't belong among the stars. The blade his grandfather forged that day, the one that now rested in its simple wooden scabbard at Iran's side, represented something more profound than combat capability. It was a connection to a past most humans had forgotten in their rush to adopt alien technologies. Alien methods, alien ways of thinking and being. The old man had spent 3 months on that single blade, working in the hours between his shifts at the colony's water reclamation facility, sacrificing sleep and health and the little comfort his pension could buy. He had folded the steel thousands of times, creating layers so fine they were invisible to the naked eye. Each fold requiring the metal to be heated to precise temperatures, hammered flat, folded again, reheated, in an endless cycle that would have broken the patience of anyone who didn't understand what they were building. The resulting pattern rippled across the metal like water, frozen in the moment before it breaks into waves, a Damascus pattern that marked this blade as something unique in all the universe. "The dawning planet's conglomerate doesn't care about our history, grandfather," Aaron had said on one of those long nights, watching the blade take shape under hands that seemed to know the metal's secrets without being told. They only care about what we can offer them now, about whether we're worth the resources it would take to protect us, about whether we can contribute to their precious alliance. His grandfather had looked up from his work, his eyes sharp despite the cataracts that clouded them, despite the years that weighed on him like physical burdens. Then we show them what we can offer, boy. We show them that humanity isn't just another species scrambling for scraps at the galactic table. We show them that we carry something they've lost in all their technology and power and certainty. We carry memory. We carry honor. We carry the knowledge that every worthwhile thing in this universe is earned through blood and sweat, and refusing to quit even when quitting would be easier. Those words echoed in Iran's mind now as he stood in the grand hall of the dawning planet's conglomerate, surrounded by species that could crush Earth's remaining population without noticing the effort. Species that commanded technologies humans could barely comprehend, and powers that made mockery of human achievement. The blade at his side suddenly felt both impossibly heavy and weightlessly inadequate, a child's toy brought to a gathering of gods. The hall itself defied human comprehension in ways that made Aaron's head hurt when he tried to process what he was seeing. It wasn't a building in any traditional sense, wasn't constructed according to principles of architecture that human minds could parse. Platforms of solidified light floated in a vast, spherical space that seemed to have no actual walls, held in position by forces Aaron couldn't name and didn't understand. Transparent sections along what might have been walls revealed observation galleries where hundreds of alien species watched the proceedings, some floating in specialized atmosphere bubbles that glowed with bioluminescence, others perched on supports that seemed to grow from nothing, a few existing as pure energy contained in geometric fields that hurt to look at directly. Through the transparent ceiling that curved above them all, plasma clouds twisted in colors that had no names in human languages, and distant stars burned with light that had traveled for centuries to reach this moment, to bear witness to humanity's judgment. The air tasted wrong in ways that went beyond simple chemistry. It smelled of ozone and metals that didn't exist in Earth's periodic table, of compounds that human lungs weren't designed to process, of the accumulated breath of 1,000 different species, all trying to coexist in a space that could never truly accommodate them all. The temperature shifted constantly as environmental systems struggled to find some middle ground between species that preferred near-freezing temperatures and others that thrived in heat that would have boiled human blood. Aaron's breath came short and fast, his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough that he wondered if the beings around him could hear it, could sense his fear like predators scenting wounded prey. He felt the weight of thousands of eyes, and things that weren't quite eyes, organs of perception that operated on principles humans had never evolved to understand, focused on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl and his stomach clench. Mira Ravel stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder with a grip that was both comforting and desperate, her fingers digging into his flesh hard enough that he knew there would be bruises later. She was young for a diplomat, barely 30, chosen for this mission because she understood both the old ways and the new realities, because she could speak the language of tradition while navigating the complexities of interstellar politics. Her face, usually so carefully controlled that it might have been carved from stone, showed cracks in its composure that frightened Aaron more than anything else about this situation. Her lips pressed into a thin line that had gone white, with pressure in her eyes, dark and intense and usually so confident, darted between the assembled representatives with something approaching panic. "You are our chance, Aaron," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the susurrus of alien languages being translated by the hall systems, over the hum of technology and the rustle of beings that didn't breathe air shifting in whatever they used for anticipation. "You are the last bastion of human resilience. Everything we've worked for, everything we've sacrificed, everything we've built since leaving Earth, it all comes down to this moment, to you, to that blade. I know it's not fair. I know you're just a boy, but we have nothing else. We are nothing else." Aaron wanted to tell her that he was just a kid, just a boy who was good with his hands and better at listening than talking. Just someone who happened to carry his grandfather's blade because the old man had died 3 weeks ago from exposure to the forged chemicals that had slowly poisoned him over decades of work because there was no one else left who knew the craft or cared enough to learn it. But the words stuck in his throat, too honest and too terrifying to speak aloud in this place where humanity's entire future hung on the edge of a challenge they didn't understand and couldn't refuse. The platform shifted with a sound like distant bells, and a hush fell over the hall that felt like physical pressure against Aaron's eardrums. Not silence. That was impossible with so many species present, with so many different methods of communication filling the air, but a focusing of attention that made every molecule in his body scream at him to run, to hide, to do anything except stand here exposed before beings that could end him with a thought. His knees wanted to buckle, wanted to drop him to the floor in a position of supplication that his lizard brain insisted was the only appropriate response to this much concentrated power. His hand found the grip of his blade, and the familiar feel of the wrapped handle helped center him, helped remind him that he was more than just his fear. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice cutting through the terror. When you're lost in the storm, boy, feel the blade. It knows the way home even when you don't. Commander Draxel Wren materialized on one of the larger platforms in a shimmer of transported matter, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop by 10 degrees despite the environmental controls working at full capacity. He was massive in ways that went beyond simple physical size, easily 3 meters tall, but seeming larger because of the sheer presence he radiated, the absolute certainty of his own supremacy. His body looked like it had been sculpted from living stone by an artist who understood anatomy but didn't care about proportion, then given a coating of blue-black skin that rippled with bioluminescent veins like lightning frozen beneath the surface. Those veins pulsed with a steady blue glow that spoke of calm confidence. But as his gaze swept the hall like a searchlight and locked onto Aaron, they began to shift toward purple, the color of amusement mixed with contempt in Draskar physiology. The Draskar were one of the conglomerate's military powerhouses, a species that had conquered 17 solar systems before joining the Alliance, that had fought wars against enemies humans couldn't imagine, and won through sheer application of overwhelming force. They valued strength above all else, measured worth in combat capability and resource acquisition, and viewed diplomacy as something inferior species did when they were too weak to simply take what they wanted and kill anyone who objected. Draxel embodied all of this and more, was the living incarnation of Draskar philosophy. His armor integrated into his very body through biotechnological methods that human scientists couldn't replicate and didn't fully understand, gleamed with barely contained threats. Blade edges that could extend at will from forearms and calves, energy projectors embedded in his palms that could reduce flesh to ash in microseconds, defensive fields powered by his own metabolic processes that could stop projectiles traveling at significant fractions of light speed. His eyes, 3 of them arranged in a triangular pattern on his broad face, fixed on Aaron with the focus of a predator that had found something small and helpless. Then they dropped to the blade at the boy's side, and something shifted in his expression. For a moment there was silence, absolute and total, as if the entire hall held its breath. Then Draxel began to laugh. It started as a low rumble deep in his chest, like distant thunder rolling across plains before a storm, then built into a roar that echoed through the hall's vast space, bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't have been able to reflect sound. Other species joined in, not all of them, but enough that the laughter became a wave of sound that crashed over Aaron like a physical force. The Valkyrians chittered in their high-pitched voices. The Morgothi rumbled in subsonic frequencies that made Iran's teeth ache. The crystalline collective chimed like breaking glass. The sound crashed over Iran in waves, and he felt his face burn with shame and anger. Felt his hands clench into fists at his sides while his heart hammered so hard he thought it might tear itself apart. He knew what they saw when they looked at his blade, understood the image it presented to beings who commanded technologies that could reshape matter at the atomic level. They saw a primitive weapon, something their ancestors might have used in the dim prehistory before they discovered fire, or the wheel, or the fundamental forces of the universe. To beings who could split atoms with thought-controlled devices and reshape matter with programmable assemblers and cross interstellar distances in the blink of an eye, a forged steel blade was less than a toy. It was a joke, an insult to their intelligence, evidence of humanity's complete inadequacy for membership in their alliance. "What is this?" Draxel's voice boomed through the hall's translation system, rendered simultaneously in hundreds of languages, the words carrying contempt so thick it was almost visible. "This species, these humans who grovel before us, seeking acceptance, they dare to present themselves before the conglomerate carrying what? A piece of old iron? A relic from their muddy past when they scratched in dirt and hit each other with rocks?" He gestured at Iran with one massive hand, his bioluminescent veins now pulsing with brilliant purple that lit up his entire torso. "They cannot even manufacture proper weapons. They carry their primitiveness like a badge of honor, expecting us to see value in their backwards ways. They are an embarrassment to intelligent life everywhere." The laughter grew louder, feeding on itself, becoming a roar that threatened to drown out thought itself. Aaron could feel it pressing against him, could feel the weight of their mockery like hands pushing him down, trying to force him to his knees, to make him acknowledge his own inadequacy. Beside him, Mira's hand tightened on his shoulder until her nails bit into his flesh through his thin shirt. He could feel her trembling, could sense the desperation radiating from her like heat from a forge. She had fought for months to get humanity this chance, had navigated political nightmares that would have broken stronger people, had survived 3 assassination attempts from species that didn't want humanity in the conglomerate, had sacrificed her own health and sanity and any hope of a normal life to bring them to this moment. And now it was crumbling like sand before their eyes because of one alien's prejudice and the conglomerate's inflexible rules. This was worse than they had anticipated in their darkest planning sessions, worse than the nightmare scenarios Mira had made him practice for. The conglomerate's evaluation was supposed to be a series of tests spread over days or weeks, carefully controlled demonstrations of human capabilities, opportunities to prove that, despite their technological disadvantages, humanity had something valuable to offer. Knowledge of biology from studying dozens of different colony worlds, cultural adaptability from surviving in environments that weren't designed for them, raw, stubborn determination that kept them alive when every logical analysis said they should have gone extinct. Instead, they had walked into a courtroom where the verdict was already being written in Draxel's contempt, where humanity's fate would be decided in the next few minutes based on the whim of a being who had already decided they were worthless. Captain Inerl, the head of the Interstellar Council and the closest thing the conglomerate had to a supreme authority, manifested above them all in a shimmer of energy that made Aaron's eyes water. The being was difficult to look at directly, painful in the way that staring at the sun was painful, a shimmer of light and shadow that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Roughly humanoid in shape, but the details kept shifting, sliding between forms as if Narel's true nature was something human minds couldn't quite process and could only approximate. The voice that emanated from the entity was low and vibrating, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating in Aaron's chest and bones and teeth. "Commander Draxel," Neril said, and the hall fell silent with a speed that suggested the other species feared this being in ways that went beyond simple respect. "Your objection is noted and recorded. However, the humans have requested the right to demonstrate their worth according to their own traditions and cultural practices. The conglomerate charter, which your own species helped write, allows for such demonstrations provided they do not violate the core principles of the Alliance." Draxel's veins flared brighter, shifting from purple toward red, aggression starting to mix with his contempt. "Then let them demonstrate. Let them show us the value of their precious traditions." He gestured broadly with both arms, and a section of the platform beneath him solidified from light into something physical. Matter called into being by technologies that made human science look like children playing with sticks. A combat mannequin appeared, roughly humanoid in shape but standing 2.5 meters tall, broader than any human had ever been. Its surface gleamed with an oil-slick rainbow sheen that shifted and flowed, the telltale signature of nano-composite armor that could reconfigure itself in response to threats. "This is a standard Draskar training dummy," Draxil announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "It is constructed from materials that can withstand direct plasma fire at temperatures that would vaporize most known substances, kinetic impacts at velocities exceeding escape velocity for most planets, and corrosive atmospheres that would dissolve unprotected organic matter in seconds. It incorporates adaptive defensive fields powered by microfusion generators that can redistribute energy from impacts across its entire surface area, making it effectively impervious to any conventional assault. The armor's nanostructure can reorganize itself in microseconds to counter specific threats. It represents the pinnacle of Draskar defensive technology, proven in actual combat against enemies that would terrify your species into paralysis. He turned to face Aaron directly, and his expression twisted into something that might have been a smile in another species but looked like a predator baring its teeth before the killing strike. His three eyes focused with laser intensity on the boy standing before him, and Aaron felt pinned like an insect under those alien gazes. If this child, the word dripped with so much disdain it was almost physically corrosive, cannot cut through this mannequin with his precious antique, with that laughable piece of scrap metal he carries like it means something, then humanity will be removed from the candidacy list immediately and permanently. Your weakness will be documented for all species to see. Your inadequacy will be proven beyond any possible dispute. You will return to your failing colonies to struggle and die without the conglomerate's support, without our protection, without even the possibility of ever being reconsidered. This will be humanity's last and only chance. The murmur that ran through the hall was like wind through dead leaves, like the rustling of predators moving through darkness. Some species seemed to find this perfectly fair, nodding or making whatever gestures indicated agreement in their physiologies. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing, unwilling to contradict a Draskar commander in public forum. A few watched with what might have been pity, but pity didn't change the rules. This was the Draskar way: trial by strength, proof by action, shame or glory decided in a moment, without appeal or second chances. And Narelle, bound by the Charter's rules that had been designed to prevent any single species from dominating the conglomerate, could not intervene unless the challenge violated explicit protocols. Cruelty was not a violation. Unfairness was not a violation. Only direct violence against the petitioners would trigger intervention, and Draxel had been careful to stay just inside that boundary. Aaron felt the blood drain from his face, felt his extremities go cold as his body redirected resources to his core in preparation for the shock he knew was coming. He had expected something difficult, had steeled himself for challenges that would push him to his limits and perhaps beyond. But this wasn't difficult. This was impossible. The mannequin before him represented materials science, centuries ahead of anything humans had developed, represented technologies that required industrial bases humans didn't possess and couldn't build. His blade, no matter how beautifully crafted, no matter how many hours his grandfather had poured into its creation, was still just steel and carbon, elements combined through heat and force in human sweat. Against nanocomposite armor, with adaptive fields powered by microfusion generators, it would be like trying to cut through a mountain with a kitchen knife, like trying to hold back the ocean with a bucket. Mira's hand slipped from his shoulder, and he heard her take a shaky breath beside him that sounded like it was being torn from her chest. When he glanced at her, keeping his head mostly forward because he didn't want to show weakness before these beings, he saw tears forming in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of helpless rage and grief for everything they had sacrificed and lost. She had fought for months to get humanity this chance, had navigated political nightmares and cultural minefields that would have broken people with decades more experience, had survived 3 assassination attempts from species that saw humanity as competitors for limited resources, had sacrificed her marriage and her health and her own mother's final days to be here for this moment. And now it was crumbling before her eyes because of one alien's prejudice and the conglomerate's inflexible adherence to rules that had clearly been designed to favor species like the Draskar. "Aaron," she whispered, her voice raw and broken in ways that made his chest hurt. "You don't have to do this. We can refuse the challenge. We can try to find another way. There has to be another path." "There is no other way," Aaron said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected, came out with a certainty that he didn't feel but needed to project. This is what we have. This is all we have. This is who we are. The species that keeps going when there's no logical reason to continue. That finds ways forward when every path seems blocked. If we back down now, we're admitting that we don't belong here. We're admitting that maybe they're right about us. He stepped forward, toward the mannequin that waited like a monument to his inadequacy, and the hall seemed to grow larger around him with every step. The distance couldn't have been more than 20 meters, but it felt like crossing a continent, like crossing the gulf between Earth and the stars that had seemed impossible until desperation made it necessary. Every step felt like wading through deep water, like moving through atmosphere that had turned thick and resistant. His legs trembled with each movement, threatening to betray him, to drop him to his knees before he even reached the challenge. His hands felt numb with cold despite the controlled climate, felt distant and disconnected as if they belonged to someone else. The blade at his side suddenly weighed as much as a planet, as much as all the failed hopes and desperate dreams that had brought humanity to this moment. He could feel the future of billions of humans pressing down on his shoulders, could feel the weight of every person who had died in the colony ships during the exodus from Earth, every person who had perished in the early days of settlement when they didn't understand the alien environments they were trying to survive in, every person who had sacrificed and struggled and refused to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. He could feel the ghosts of his ancestors watching from wherever the dead went, could feel his grandfather's absence like a hollow space in his chest that nothing would ever fill. The old man had believed in him with a faith that seemed insane in retrospect, had looked at a 13-year-old boy and seen someone worthy of carrying forward a tradition that stretched back hundreds of years. The mannequin stood waiting, inert but threatening in its very existence. In the casual way, it represented technologies that humanity could barely comprehend. Up close, Aaron could see the complexity of its surface in ways that made his head hurt. Layers upon layers of different materials, each visible as a thin line of color when light hit it at the right angle, all working together in harmony to create something nearly invulnerable. The rainbow sheen shifted and flowed across its surface like oil on water, like the defensive fields were already activating in anticipation of his attack. The technology in this single training dummy probably exceeded the total scientific knowledge accumulated by all human colonies combined, represented more computational power than existed in humanity's entire infrastructure. Behind him, the laughter was starting again, quieter this time, but somehow more cutting. Beings that had been silent before joined in, now that they saw him standing helpless before the challenge. Now that his inadequacy was becoming obvious to even the kindest observers, the sound cut deeper than any blade, sliced through his defenses, and found the fears he kept buried. It wasn't just mockery of him personally, it was mockery of everyone who had died to get humanity to the stars, everyone who had sacrificed everything to keep the scattered colonies alive, everyone who had believed that humans had something valuable to offer the wider universe beyond their stubborn refusal to accept extinction. Aaron closed his eyes, shutting out the hall and the laughter and the impossible challenge before him. When everything else failed, his grandfather had taught him, when the world seemed too big and the task seemed impossible, return to the beginning, return to the breath, return to the center, find the quiet place inside where truth lived, where fear couldn't reach, where the essence of who you were resided beyond all the noise and terror. The hall faded from his perception like mist burning off under morning sun. The laughter faded to a distant buzz that had no more meaning than wind in trees. Even the crushing pressure of expectation faded, releasing him from its weight. In the darkness behind his eyelids, Aaron found himself transported back to the workshop on Hymar, back to the cramped space that smelled of hot metal and coal smoke and his grandfather's sweat, back to the place where he had learned everything that mattered. He could see it clearly now, more clearly than memory should have allowed. Every detail sharp and present as if he was actually there. The walls covered in tools that told stories to anyone who knew how to listen, the forge glowing orange-red like a captured piece of the sun, radiating heat that made sweat spring instantly to skin. The anvil pitted and scarred from generations of use, its surface marked with the ghosts of 10,000 strikes, and his grandfather standing at the center of it all like a high priest at an altar, his weathered hands shaping steel with movements that looked simple but contained depths of understanding that took lifetimes to master. The sound of hammer striking heated steel rang through his memory, rhythmic and hypnotic, each strike placed with absolute precision. The smell of coal smoke filled his lungs, mixed with the acrid scent of hot metal and the earthy smell of the quenching water. His grandfather's voice came to him, not as memory, but as if the old man stood beside him in this mental space, as if death was just another barrier that determination could overcome. The blade is a path, boy, not the destination. The path itself. It doesn't choose the weak because the weak can't walk it to its end. It demands strength, but not the kind these aliens understand. Not the strength of machines or weapons or technologies that do your thinking for you. It demands the strength that comes from patience, from doing the same thing 1,000 times until you understand it in your bones, from faith in something you can't prove but know is true anyway. Every layer, every fold of the metal, every strike of the hammer, these are all parts of the path. These are the steps that lead to understanding, and you must feel it, truly feel it, become one with it until there's no difference between you and the work you're doing. Aaron remembered the nights he had spent in that workshop, the hours that had blurred together into one continuous experience of learning and growth. His grandfather never rushed, never showed frustration even when Aaron made mistakes that ruined hours of work, never doubted that eventually understanding would come. Each motion the old man made was deliberate, purposeful, part of a larger pattern that couldn't be hurried without losing something essential. The steel was folded thousands of times, creating layers so thin that light itself seemed to get lost trying to penetrate them. Each fold required the metal to be heated to precisely the right temperature. Too cold and it wouldn't bond properly. Too hot and it would burn and become brittle. The quenching in water, oil, or special solutions his grandfather had developed through decades of experimentation, each one designed to adjust the blade's properties in specific ways. The grinding that took days of patient work, slowly revealing the pattern locked inside the steel. The polishing that made the surface mirror bright. The final sharpening that could take a week, using stones of progressively finer grain until the edge could split a human hair lengthwise. This blade remembers, his grandfather had said on the day he presented it to Aaron, the day that had turned out to be 3 weeks before his death, though neither of them had known it then. The old man had looked smaller than usual, diminished by the illness that the forge chemicals had planted in his lungs years ago. But his eyes had been bright with something beyond mere life. It remembers every strike that shaped it, every fold that gave it structure, every moment of its creation. When you hold it, you're not just holding metal. You're holding all of that memory, all of that purpose, all of that accumulated knowledge and skill. Don't try to force it to do what you want. That's the mistake most people make. They think weapons are tools that you control. But this blade is more than a tool. Learn to listen to what it knows. Learn to feel what it's trying to tell you. It understands things that your conscious mind can't process, things that can only be learned through creation and use. Iran opened his eyes and the hall snapped back into focus around him, but something fundamental had changed. The laughter no longer touched him, no longer had the power to make him feel small or inadequate. The impossible mannequin before him was still impossible according to every rational analysis. But that didn't matter anymore, because his grandfather hadn't taught him to do the possible. The old man had taught him to do what needed to be done, regardless of whether logic said it could be accomplished, regardless of whether anyone believed it would work. He moved into the stance his grandfather had called the stance of stillness, the position that looked simple but contained layers of meaning that took years to fully understand. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed between them so that he could move in any direction without telegraphing his intention. Body relaxed but ready, muscles engaged just enough to maintain position, but not so tense that they would fatigue quickly or limit his range of motion. Arms loose at his sides, hands ready but not clenched. His breath slowed, deepened, became something he controlled rather than something that controlled him. Each inhalation drew in the moment, pulled it into his center where it could be examined and understood. Each exhalation released everything that didn't matter. The fear, the pressure, the voices in his head saying this couldn't be done. The laughter became background noise, no more significant than the hum of the hall's environmental systems. The watching aliens became irrelevant, just more background details that had no bearing on what he needed to do. Even Mira, even his fear for humanity's future, even the weight of all those billions depending on him, all of it fell away until there was only Aaron, the blade, and the mannequin. Only the path that needed to be walked. Only the next step that needed to be taken. The blade came free of its scabbard with a whisper of steel sliding against wood, a sound so soft that it should have been inaudible in the vast space of the hall. But in the silence that had fallen, every being present heard it, felt it like a change in air pressure before a storm. In the shifting lights of the hall, reflected from 1,000 alien sources, the blade seemed to come alive in ways that went beyond mere reflection. The folded pattern in the steel created ripples that shifted and flowed as he moved, each layer catching light differently, creating an effect like water flowing or clouds passing overhead. It was beautiful in a way that transcended decoration, beautiful because every part of it had purpose, because form and function had been unified through human hands and human will into something greater than either alone could achieve. Drexel's laughter stopped abruptly, cut off mid-sound as if someone had thrown a switch. Something in Iran's posture, in his absolute focus, in the way he held the blade, penetrated even the Draskar's arrogance and contempt. The commander's bioluminescent veins shifted from purple back toward blue, but with threads of yellow beginning to show, uncertainty creeping in, like cracks in a dam, the first hints that perhaps he had miscalculated. Neryl's form brightened slightly, the entity's attention clearly focusing on the boy with an intensity that made the air around Aaron seem to shimmer. The murmuring in the hall died down to nothing, every species falling silent as they watched something that felt significant in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Even beings that had been ignoring the proceedings, that had considered humanity's petition too trivial to warrant their attention, turned their various sensory organs toward the human child standing alone before an impossible challenge. Aaron spoke, and his voice carried through the hall's translation system to every being present, rendered in hundreds of languages simultaneously, but losing nothing in the translation. He spoke not to Draxel, not even to humanity, but to Neryl, to the one being in this hall who might understand that strength came in forms that couldn't be measured by instruments or quantified in specifications. This blade was forged by my grandfather over the course of 3 months, Aaron began, and his voice was steady despite the hammering of his heart, despite the terror that still lived in his belly, even though he had locked it away where it couldn't affect his actions. He worked on it in the hours between his shifts at the water reclamation facility, sacrificing sleep and health and any chance at rest. He started with raw steel, nothing special, nothing enhanced, nothing that would register as unusual to your instruments, just iron and carbon in proportions that humans discovered thousands of years ago. He heated it until it glowed like a small sun, until the metal became plastic and malleable. Then he hammered it flat, folded it in half, heated it again, hammered it again. He did this thousands of times, each cycle requiring perfect temperature control, perfect timing, perfect technique. He raised the blade slightly, letting the light play across its surface, letting them see the pattern that marked it as something unique in all the universe. Each fold doubled the layers. Each strike of the hammer aligned the crystalline structure of the metal, organized the molecules in ways that made them work together instead of against each other. Each heating and cooling cycle adjusted the carbon content, modified the hardness in specific areas, created flexibility where it was needed, and rigidity where that mattered more. By the time he finished, this blade contained more than 1 million layers of steel. Each individual layer is thinner than a human hair, thinner than many of the cells in my body. Together, they create something stronger than any single piece of metal could ever be, no matter how advanced its composition. Aaron turned the blade slowly, showing different angles, letting them see how the pattern shifted and changed depending on perspective. The pattern you see isn't decoration applied after the fact. It's not etched or painted or overlaid. It's the visible proof of those layers, the signature of the process, unique to this blade and this blade alone. No two blades forged this way are ever identical, just as no two humans are ever identical. This pattern is like a fingerprint, evidence of the specific conditions and choices and random variations that went into its creation. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, fueled by passion and pride, and the bone-deep certainty that what his grandfather had created mattered in ways these aliens needed to understand. He quenched it in water drawn from Hymar's deepest aquifer, water that took decades to filter down through layers of rock and soil, water that contains trace minerals that seeped into the steel structure during the cooling process. Those minerals don't just sit on the surface. They become part of the molecular matrix, altering properties in subtle ways that can't be replicated in a lab. He ground it on stones imported from Earth at enormous expense. Stones that had been used by his father and his father's father. Stones that had shaped blades for 30 generations. He sharpened it using techniques that have been passed down for longer than that. Techniques that were old when humanity first looked up at the stars and dreamed of reaching them. Techniques that required him to understand not just the blade, but the stones themselves, how they cut, how they wore, how they interacted with steel at the microscopic level. The hall was absolutely silent now. Even the translation system seemed to have paused, as if the machines themselves were listening and didn't want to interrupt with their mechanical processing. Aaron could feel something shifting in the atmosphere. Some subtle change in how the assembled species were regarding him and his weapon. A shift from contempt to something that wasn't quite respect, but was at least attention. Recognition that perhaps they had been too quick to judge. "You call this primitive," Aaron continued, his eyes finding and holding Draxil's alien gaze. "But primitive doesn't mean inferior. It means fundamental. It means dealing with the basic building blocks of reality without layers of technology to insulate you from the consequences of mistakes. It means we understand what we create at the deepest possible level because we created ourselves piece by piece, layer by layer, moment by moment. Your mannequin might be advanced, might represent the pinnacle of your material science and your technological capabilities. But this blade," he held it before him like an offering or a challenge, "represents something you've lost in all your advancement and sophistication and certainty. It represents the soul of the creator, bound into the creation. It represents the belief that anything worth having is worth the time and pain and patience required to make it perfect. It represents the understanding that shortcuts and automation and letting machines do your thinking for you cost something that can't be measured in efficiency or output." Neryl's form pulsed with light in patterns that seemed almost agitated, as if the entity was experiencing something close to emotion. Beautiful words, young human. Compelling philosophy. But words alone do not demonstrate capability in the empirical sense. The challenge stands as stated. Can your blade of memory and soul achieve what Commander Draxil claims is impossible? Can philosophy cut through reality? Aaron looked at the mannequin, really looked at it for the first time without the veil of fear distorting his perception. Its surface gleamed with that oil-slick rainbow sheen, the defensive fields already active, already waiting to redistribute whatever force he brought to bear. The nanocomposite armor underneath represented material science that was centuries ahead of anything humans had developed, represented technologies that required industrial bases and computational resources humanity simply didn't possess. The internal structure visible through transparent sections showed layers of different materials, each one designed to counter specific types of attacks, all of them working together to create something that should be effectively invulnerable to anything a human could do. By any logical analysis, by any rational examination of the physical properties involved, what he was being asked to do was impossible. The physics didn't support it, the material science didn't allow it, it simply could not be done. But his grandfather's voice whispered in his mind, cutting through the logic and the analysis and the certainty of failure. "The blade knows the way, boy. Trust it." Aaron took another breath, deeper than before, pulling it down into the bottom of his lungs, holding it for a moment, then releasing it slowly through slightly parted lips. He felt the weight of the blade in his hand, not as burden, but as extension of himself. He felt the balance point where the guard met the handle, felt how the weight distribution changed as he moved it. He felt the living texture of the wrapped grip against his palm, felt the slight roughness that provided purchase without requiring him to clench tightly. He extended his awareness into the weapon, not trying to force it to do anything, but trying to feel what it felt, know what it knew, understand what it was trying to tell him. Through the connection between them, the blade had been folded thousands of times, creating a structure so complex that it bordered on the chaotic, creating patterns at scales too small for human eyes to see, but no less real for being invisible. Each layer had its own properties, its own characteristics determined by exact temperature and timing, and the minerals in the quenching water and 1,000 other variables that couldn't be perfectly controlled. Together, they created something that was more than the sum of its parts. A weapon that could flex without breaking because different layers had different rigidities, that could hold an edge finer than a molecule because the crystalline structures were aligned and supported by their neighbors, that could transmit force with minimal energy loss because the layers slid against each other in ways that reduced friction and vibration. He moved into position, the blade held in a guard his grandfather had taught him, a position that looked deceptively simple, but that the old man had spent years perfecting. Blade angled slightly downward, point aimed at the mannequin's center mass. Body turned to present a smaller target, weight evenly distributed but ready to shift instantly. Arms relaxed, shoulders loose, breathing steady and controlled. It looked simple, but like everything his grandfather had taught him, the simplicity concealed layers of complexity that took years to understand. Every muscle in his body was engaged but not tense, ready to move in any direction, but committed to none until the moment of action arrived. His weight rested on the balls of his feet, allowing for instant response. His eyes focused not on any specific point, but on the whole mannequin, taking in the entire shape without fixating on details. The laughter had completely stopped. The hall held its collective breath, or whatever passed for breath among species that didn't use oxygen. Mira stood with her hands clenched so tightly at her sides that her nails drew blood from her palms, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. Draxil watched with his bioluminescent veins now pulsing between blue and yellow, his arrogance fighting with a growing sense of unease, his three eyes wide as they tracked Aaron's preparations. Aaron moved. It wasn't a dramatic motion, wasn't the kind of flashy attack that looked impressive in action vids. There was no great windup, no visible gathering of force, no theatrical flourish. His grandfather had taught him that true cuts that mattered, came from the whole body working in perfect harmony, not from arm strength or dramatic gestures. The power started in his legs, in the muscles of his thighs and calves that pushed against the ground. It traveled up through his hips, through the rotation of his core that added rotational force to linear motion. It flowed through his shoulders and down his arms, every joint contributing to the total energy being delivered, every muscle firing in precise sequence to maximize efficiency. And finally, it expressed itself through the blade, through the tool that had been designed over generations to transmit and focus all that accumulated force into the smallest possible area. The movement was so smooth, so practiced from thousands of repetitions, that it looked almost casual, a flowing step forward that built momentum, a rotation of the hips that added torsion, a gentle sweep of the arms that brought the blade through an arc as precise as planetary motion, as inevitable as gravity. The blade met the mannequin's defensive field with a sound like a whisper, like wind passing through leaves, like the breath of something ancient and patient. Not a clang or a crash or any of the sounds that movies and vids had trained people to expect from blade strikes. Just a soft hiss of steel moving through air, and then through the field, and then nothing. The mannequin stood unchanged, its surface showing no mark, no scratch, no indication that it had been touched. The defensive fields flickered slightly where the blade had passed through, but stabilized immediately. The nanocomposite armor showed no damage whatsoever, no indication that anything had happened. The hall remained silent, but the quality of that silence changed, became the silence of people waiting for a punchline, of audiences watching a magic trick where the reveal was taking too long. Aaron stepped back, lowering the blade to a neutral position. His face showed no expression, no disappointment or frustration or defeat. He simply stood, centered in that place of stillness his grandfather had taught him to find, breathing steadily, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that some things took time to manifest. Draxil's laughter erupted again, louder than before, triumphant in ways that made it painful to hear. You see? You see the futility of your primitive ways? This is what humanity offers. Pretty speeches and useless gestures. They are not worthy of our time or consideration. They have proven their own inadequacy more completely than I ever could. His bioluminescent veins blazed with triumphant purple that spread across his entire body like wildfire. Remove them from the candidacy list. Strike their petition from the records. Let them return to their failing colonies to struggle and die without the conglomerate's support or protection. Let this be a lesson to any other backward species that might seek to join us without having earned the right. The murmuring started again, agreement spreading through the hall like ripples across water. Some species nodded or made gestures of satisfaction. Others looked away, embarrassed to have wasted time on this farce. A few watched Iran with what might have been pity, but pity didn't change outcomes, didn't alter the fact that he had failed in the most public way possible. Mira's hands came up to cover her face, her shoulders shaking with sobs she was trying, desperately to control. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, all of it had been for nothing. They would return to the colonies as failures, would bring news that humanity had been rejected, that there would be no protection or support or hope of advancement. The scattered human worlds would continue their slow decline, would continue to fail one by one until the species that had dreamed of the stars became just another footnote in the conglomerate's vast historical records. Then the mannequin moved. It wasn't a dramatic movement at first, wasn't the kind of collapse that would have been obviously visible to every observer. Just a slight shift, almost imperceptible, a settling that suggested something fundamental had changed in its structure. But then, starting from the exact point where Iran's blade had touched it, a line appeared. Not a scratch or a mark on the surface. A line, thin as a thread, perfect as a geometric construction, running straight and true through the center of the mannequin's mass. The line grew, spreading with crystalline precision that spoke to forces operating at scales too small to see. It traveled down through the mannequin's torso, through layers of nanocomposite armor that shouldn't have been separable, through defensive fields that should have prevented any penetration. The rainbow sheen of the fields began to flicker more violently, tried to compensate for the structural failure they were detecting, tried to redistribute force that wasn't there anymore, tried to adapt to a threat they couldn't analyze or understand. The nanocomposite armor itself, that marvel of advanced material science that could supposedly withstand anything short of a direct antimatter detonation, began to separate along that line. The adaptive systems meant to repair damage and redistribute stress started to fail, their programming unable to cope with a failure mode they had never been designed to handle. The line widened fractionally, and through the growing gap, the internal structure of the mannequin became visible. Layers of different materials, each one color-coded for the specific type of attack it was meant to counter, all of them now cleanly divided as if by laser precision. The mannequin stood for another heartbeat, for another 2 heartbeats, held together by nothing more than the memory of its original form, by the molecular bonds that hadn't quite realized they were broken yet. The defensive fields flickered wildly, creating patterns of light that would have been beautiful if they hadn't represented a catastrophic system failure. The nanocomposite surface rippled and flowed as it tried to seal the breach, tried to reconnect separated layers, tried to do what it was designed to do, and failed because the failure had happened at a level its programming couldn't address. Then, with a groan of stressed materials that sounded almost alive, almost pained, the mannequin split completely. The 2 halves toppled in opposite directions, falling with the slow-motion inevitability of buildings collapsing, of glaciers calving, of certainties becoming dust. They hit the platform with twin thuds that echoed through the hall like hammer strikes, like the sound of a gavel closing a case, like the sound of destiny arriving whether you were ready for it or not. The silence that followed was absolute in ways that transcended mere absence of sound. It was the silence of beings whose understanding of reality had just been challenged, whose certainties had just been shaken, whose assumptions had just been revealed as incomplete. Not a sound, not a breath, not the whisper of a translation system, or the hum of life support, or the rustle of movement. Thousands of beings from hundreds of species stared at the fallen mannequin, at the boy standing with the blade in his hand, at the impossible thing that had just become possible, and none of them knew what to say or think or do. Mira's hands flew from her face to her mouth, covering what might have been a sob or a laugh, or some combination of both that human language had no word for. Her eyes, wide with shock that bordered on religious awe, streamed with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away, didn't even seem to notice. She looked at Iran, then at the mannequin split cleanly in two perfect halves, then back at Iran as if unable to reconcile what her eyes were showing her with what her mind insisted was possible. Her lips moved, trying to form words, but nothing came out except small sounds of disbelief and wonder and relief so intense it was almost painful. Norel's form blazed with light, pulsing in patterns that raced across the entity's surface like lightning through clouds. Patterns that might have been the equivalent of intense surprise, or perhaps intense interest, or perhaps something that had no human emotional equivalent at all. The other council members on their floating platforms leaned forward in their various ways, some physically, others through extending sensory organs, still others through intensifying whatever fields or forces they used to perceive the world. Recording devices activated throughout the observation galleries, capturing every angle of the split mannequin, documenting evidence of something that should not have been possible according to their understanding of physics and material science. Aaron, for his part, simply lowered the blade to his side in a smooth motion that showed no triumph, no pride, no celebration of what he had accomplished. His face remained calm, centered in that place of stillness his grandfather had taught him to find. Inside, his heart hammered like the old man's forge hammer pounding steel. His blood sang with adrenaline and relief, and a joy so pure it threatened to overwhelm him. But he had learned to keep that internal storm from reaching his surface, had learned that showing emotion at the wrong moment could be as dangerous as showing weakness. He looked at the blade in his hand, examined it with the critical eye his grandfather had taught him to use, saw no damage to its edge, no chips or rolls, or any indication that it had just done something that violated the known laws of material science. The blade looked exactly as it had before the strike, perfect, unmarked, ready to be used again if necessary. The pattern in the steel still rippled across its surface like frozen water, each layer still catching light in its own unique way. It was as if the impossible thing that had just happened had cost the blade nothing, had been achieved through something other than brute force or energy expenditure, had been accomplished through principles that the conglomerate's instruments couldn't measure and their theories couldn't explain. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory one more time, gentler now, almost proud. "The blade knows the way, boy. It always has. You just had to trust it enough to follow." Draxel stood frozen on his platform, his massive frame locked in a position that suggested his brain hadn't yet processed what his eyes had just witnessed. His three eyes were wide enough to show whites around the pupils, if Draskar eyes had whites, wide enough that they looked almost comical in his broad face. His bioluminescent veins flashed through colors in rapid succession, purple to blue to yellow to red, and back again in cycles that became faster and more erratic with each repetition, a cascade of confusion and disbelief, and something that might have been the Draskar equivalent of existential horror. His massive hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the servos in his armor whining as they tried to accommodate movements that weren't quite making sense. His mouth worked, jaw muscles flexing as he tried to form words, but no sound came out except small clicking noises that might have been his teeth grinding together. The unthinkable had occurred. The impossible had become real, and Draxel's entire worldview was crumbling like a structure built on sand. He had been wrong, spectacularly and publicly wrong, had staked his pride in his species' reputation and his own position on a certainty that had turned out to be anything but certain. Worse than being wrong, he had been wrong about something fundamental, had been proven inadequate in his understanding of the very principles of strength and capability that defined Draskar culture. And he had been proven wrong by a human child, by a member of a species he had dismissed as primitive and worthless, by someone wielding a weapon he had mocked as obsolete scrap metal. The first sound to break the silence was a chirping whistle from one of the avian species in the observation galleries. A sound that started low and uncertain, but grew in volume and confidence as the being realized others were listening. It was picked up by other members of that species, then spread to other species entirely. Different sounds in different languages, but all expressing the same fundamental thing: astonishment, wonder, recognition that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. The whispers grew into murmurs as beings turned to their neighbors and tried to process what they had seen. The murmurs grew into excited conversations as groups began analyzing and theorizing and debating. Beings that had been indifferent to humanity moments before, that had considered the petition too trivial to warrant serious attention, now stared at Iran with expressions that ranged from respect to fascination to something approaching fear. They had underestimated this species, had assumed that technological advancement was the only measure of capability that mattered, had forgotten that the universe was deeper and stranger than their instruments could measure. And that realization was forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew, not just about humanity, but about the nature of strength and worth and what it meant to be civilized. Narel's voice cut through the growing noise with the precision of a surgical laser, silencing the hall instantly. Explain. The single word carried the weight of absolute authority, the demand of an entity that expected immediate compliance. Explain how a blade of simple steel achieved what should be impossible by every known principle of material science and physics. Explain in terms that can be verified and understood. Aaron looked up at the shifting entity, meeting whatever passed for Narel's gaze without flinching, without showing the fear that he still felt in his gut. I don't fully understand it myself, he admitted, and there was no shame in his voice, just honest acknowledgement of the limits of his knowledge. My grandfather tried to explain it once, tried to put into words something that he understood more through his hands than through his mind. He said that when steel is folded enough times, when the layers become small enough and numerous enough, the properties change in ways that our simple theories don't account for. It stops being just the sum of its components and becomes something else. A material with internal structures at scales so small that they can interact with forces at the molecular level, at the quantum level, at scales where the normal rules start to break down. He gestured at the fallen mannequin with his free hand, using the motion to help organize his thoughts. Your nano-composite armor is designed to resist macro-scale attacks, plasma blasts that deliver enormous amounts of thermal energy, kinetic impacts that try to overwhelm structural integrity through brute force, corrosive chemicals that attack molecular bonds. It's brilliant engineering, probably the best defensive technology in the known galaxy. It redistributes energy across its surface area, disperses force through multiple layers, adapts to threats it can measure and quantify and respond to according to program parameters. He raised the blade slightly, letting the light play across its rippled surface. But this blade doesn't attack at that scale. It doesn't try to overwhelm your defenses with energy or force. Each layer of steel, each fold in the metal, creates edges at the microscopic level, at scales smaller than your sensors can detect or your defensive systems can respond to. When I cut, I'm not just hitting the armor with a single edge driven by muscle power. I'm hitting it with thousands of edges, maybe millions, each one working at a different depth, a different angle, finding the spaces between molecules, the quantum gaps in the material structure that have to exist because nothing is truly solid at small enough scales. He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to explain something that existed more as feeling than as intellectual understanding. Or maybe it's something else entirely. Maybe my grandfather's spirit guided the blade, lived in it somehow through all those hours of work and belief. Maybe there's something in human will, in human stubbornness and refusal to accept defeat, that your instruments can't measure because it exists outside the physical realm your science acknowledges. Maybe the universe respects dedication and craft and the pouring of self into creation in ways that transcend your physics, that operate according to rules that predate your science and will outlast it. His voice became quieter, more introspective. I don't know which explanation is true. Maybe they're both true. Maybe they're both wrong, and the real answer is something neither of us can understand with our current frameworks. What I do know is that my grandfather taught me to trust the blade, to listen to what it was trying to tell me, to believe that proper preparation and proper technique and proper respect for the craft would be enough. And the blade cut. The evidence is there on your platform. The impossible became possible because someone believed it could and had done the work to make belief into reality. The explanation hung in the air between them, half science and half mysticism, probably satisfying no one completely but impossible to dismiss, given the physical evidence lying split and broken on the platform before them. Scientific beings throughout the hall were already beginning calculations, running simulations in their heads or their implants or their portable computational devices, trying to construct theoretical frameworks that could explain what they had witnessed. Spiritual beings were adding this to their libraries of inexplicable phenomena, filing it away with other events that suggested the universe contained more than matter and energy and the forces that bound them. And everyone present, regardless of their philosophical inclinations, would remember that they had witnessed something unprecedented, that they had watched a human child achieve the impossible with tools that should have been inadequate. Draxel finally found his voice, and it came out as a strangled roar that was equal parts fury and desperation. Fraud, deception, trickery, and lies. His bioluminescent veins blazed pure red now, the color of extreme aggression in Draskar biology, the color that usually preceded violence. The mannequin was sabotaged before the test. The structural integrity was compromised. The test was rigged from the beginning. This human child could not have accomplished this through legitimate means. It violates everything we know about materials and forces and the fundamental laws that govern reality. Commander Draxil, Neryl's voice was sharp as broken glass, hard as diamond, cutting through the Draskar's protestations with contempt that was all the more devastating for being delivered without apparent emotion. The mannequin was your own, constructed by your own technicians according to your own specifications, observed by neutral parties throughout its preparation and deployment. The Council's sensors monitored it continuously from the moment it materialized until the moment it was cut. If you suggest it was sabotaged, you accuse your own people of incompetence or treachery. If you insist the test was rigged, you accuse yourself of complicity in a fraud before this entire assembly. Choose your next words with great care, Commander. Then the blade is not what it appears. Draxil's voice rose in pitch, desperation bleeding through his fury like blood seeping through bandages. It must contain hidden technology, nanosystems of their own design, quantum effects they've concealed from our scans, something that makes it more than simple steel. They've deceived us about the nature of their capabilities, hidden their true technological level behind a facade of primitiveness. They're more dangerous than they appear. His body language shifted, became more aggressive as his armor plates began to extend in defensive posture. Warning lights flickered to life along his weapon systems, energy projectors charging with a rising whine that filled the hall with tension. His three eyes fixed on Aaron with an intensity that would have melted metal, filled with something that went beyond simple anger or wounded pride. There was genuine fear there, the existential terror of someone whose entire identity had been built on certainty and superiority, and the belief that strength could overcome any challenge. Stand down, Commander. Narel's form darkened, shadows gathering in ways that suggested power being readied for deployment. You have made your challenge according to the protocols. The challenge was met and exceeded. The law is clear on this matter. Accept the outcome with whatever grace you can muster. The law? Draxil's voice cracked like breaking stone, like something fundamental giving way under pressure it could no longer withstand. His three eyes remained fixed on Aaron, and something ugly and desperate twisted in them, something that had nothing to do with logic or protocol or law. His honor had been destroyed, his pride shattered like glass, his sense of superiority revealed as delusion. For a Draskar warrior, for someone whose entire culture was built around the concept of proving worth through displays of strength, that kind of humiliation was worse than death. It was the destruction of self, the negation of everything that defined him, The revelation that he had built his life on foundations of sand. And there, standing calm and untouched by triumph or mockery, was the source of his shame. A human child who had done the impossible with tools that should have been laughable. A primitive who had shown him to be the inferior one. An embarrassment that would follow him for whatever remained of his life. The law, Draxil hissed through clenched teeth, his voice dropping to something quiet and deadly. Be damned to whatever hell spawned it. He moved with terrifying speed for something so large, his massive body launching from the platform like a missile, like a meteor descending toward impact. His armor fully deployed in mid-leap, transforming him from an imposing warrior into a killing machine designed for maximum lethality. Energy projectors charged to full power with a whine that hurt human ears, building toward discharge. Blade attachments extended from his forearms with metallic snaps, each one capable of cutting through reinforced hull plating, each one designed to cause maximum trauma and suffering. His trajectory took him directly toward Aaron in a line as straight and inevitable as gravity, claws extended, death promised in every line of his body, murder written in the blazing red of his bioluminescent veins. The hall erupted into chaos that bordered on panic. Beings scattered from their platforms in every direction, some flying, some teleporting, some simply dropping out of sight to avoid potential collateral damage. Alarms wailed through the hall systems, their discordant notes layering over each other until the sound became almost physical. Security systems activated but moved too slowly, hampered by the need to distinguish between hundreds of species and their various threat profiles, by protocols designed to prevent accidents but not fast enough to stop intentional violence. Neryl's voice boomed commands that should have frozen Draxil in his tracks but were ignored. The ancient protocols of council authority revealed as inadequate when confronted by someone willing to sacrifice everything. Mira didn't think, didn't calculate odds, or consider alternatives or weigh consequences. She just moved, her body responding to threat before her conscious mind could process what was happening. She threw herself between Draxil and Aaron with a desperation that transcended self-preservation, with a determination that came from somewhere deeper than logic or training or any reasonable assessment of her chances. She was small compared to the Draskar warrior, fragile as paper compared to stone, armed with nothing but her own body and her refusal to let Iran die without someone trying to save him. But she was fast, faster than anyone expected from a diplomat, faster than someone her size should have been able to move. The training she had undergone before this mission, the combat conditioning that had been hidden beneath her professional exterior, expressed itself in movements that were economical and precise. Her shoulder hit Aaron's chest with enough force to knock him backward, to move him out of Draxil's direct path. And in the same motion, she placed herself in the path of the energy blast that the commander's projectors had been charging. The impact lifted her off her feet like she weighed nothing, like she was made of paper caught in a hurricane. The energy discharge meant to stun Iran into helplessness so that Draxil could make him suffer before killing him, hit her full in the torso. Her body convulsed as the energy disrupted her nervous system, sent electrical chaos through neural pathways that weren't designed to handle that kind of input. Smoke rose from her clothing, where the energy had flash-heated fabric and the flesh beneath. The smell of burned organic matter filled the immediate area, acrid and wrong. She hit the platform hard enough that the sound of impact carried through the chaos, her body bouncing once before going still. She tried to breathe, managed a wet, rattling gasp that spoke to damaged lungs, and then her eyes rolled back and consciousness fled. Time seemed to fragment for Aaron, seemed to break into discontinuous moments that his brain processed separately rather than as a flowing stream. Mira falling, her body broken and smoking, sacrificing herself without hesitation. Draxil landing from his leap and spinning toward him, weapons ready for a second strike, murder in his alien eyes. The security systems finally responding, but still seconds away from interceding, too slow to matter. Neryl's form blazing with fury but bound by the need to avoid destroying the hall itself in any offensive action, by limitations that made the entity less powerful than appearance suggested, and him, Aaron, standing there with a blade in his hand and a choice to make about who he was and who he was willing to become. Something broke inside him in that frozen moment. Not his spirit, his restraint. Not his courage, his control. All the calm his grandfather had taught him, all the patience and centeredness and careful discipline that made a true warrior instead of just someone who killed with skill. It shattered against the image of Mira lying still and broken, having sacrificed herself to save him, having given everything she had because she believed in something larger than herself. Rage flooded through him, hot and pure, and absolutely focused in ways he had never experienced before. But it wasn't the wild rage of Draxel, wasn't the mindless fury that sought only destruction and cared nothing for consequences. This was the rage of the forge, the controlled heat that transformed raw materials into something stronger and more purposeful. This was the rage his grandfather had spoken of in lessons Aaron hadn't fully understood until this moment. The anger that didn't cloud judgment, but sharpened it to a lethal edge. That didn't make you stupid, but made you capable of things that calm rationality would never attempt. Aaron moved into the attack without conscious thought, his body executing patterns that had been drilled into it through thousands of hours of practice. Patterns refined by his grandfather's patient instruction and perfected now by the absolute necessity of the moment. The blade seemed to move on its own, guided by muscle memory and something deeper than memory, by the same instinct that told birds how to navigate by stars they had never studied, that told salmon how to find their spawning grounds across thousands of miles of ocean, that told humans where to strike when striking was the only option between survival and death. Draxel came at him with all the force of a small vehicle, with momentum that should have been unstoppable, weapons blazing and armor at maximum extension. He was bigger by far, stronger by measures that couldn't be quantified, faster in raw terms of acceleration and top speed. He was equipped with technology that could level buildings and shrug off artillery fire. By every rational measure, by every logical analysis, Aaron should have died in the next second. Should have been vaporized or shredded or crushed, depending on which of Draxel's weapons reached him first. But Draxel was also predictable in the way that beings who had always won through overwhelming force were predictable. He was locked into patterns of attack that assumed superiority, that expected opponents to dodge or flee or die, because those were the only options he had ever needed to consider. He expected Aaron to try to run, expected the boy to realize he was overmatched and attempt escape. He expected to chase him down, to make him suffer, to extract payment for the humiliation he had caused. Instead, Aaron stepped into the attack, moving inside Draxel's reach where size became a disadvantage, and weapons designed for maximum range became awkward and difficult to deploy. The blade flashed in movements too fast for most eyes to track, not seeking to kill because Aaron's grandfather had taught him that killing was easy and restraint was hard, that a true warrior measured strength by how much damage he could prevent while still achieving his purpose. Aaron didn't want to kill Draxel. He wanted to stop him, to disable him, to remove the threat without becoming the kind of person who killed when other options existed. His grandfather's lessons came back to him in a flood. A true warrior doesn't rely on strength alone. He relies on knowledge. Know your opponent, know their capabilities, know their limitations, know where the weak points must be, because even the strongest armor has to allow movement, has to provide access for maintenance, has to connect to the organic being inside it. The Draskar armor, for all its sophistication and integrated nature, still followed biological principles. It had joints that needed flexibility, power conduits that fed its various systems, control interfaces that connected to Draxil's nervous system, cooling systems that prevented the energy systems from cooking the wearer alive. These weak points were normally protected by speed and positioning, by the assumption that opponents would be too busy trying to survive the offensive capabilities to target specific vulnerabilities. But Iran was inside the defensive sphere now, too close for most of Draxel's weapons to target him effectively. Close enough that he could smell the ozone from the energy systems and feel the heat from the power cores. The blades sang through the air in a series of precise strikes that looked choreographed, that flowed one into another with the grace of a dance. Each strike targeted a specific point in the armor structure, each cut calculated to disable rather than destroy. One strike severed power conduits feeding the right arm, causing the limb's weapons to go dark and the armor plating to lose its powered enhancement. Another disabled the gyroscopic stabilizer in Draxel's chest plate, the system that let him maintain balance during high-speed maneuvers. A third cut through the neural interface that let the commander control his weapon systems with thought, forcing him to rely on manual controls that couldn't react fast enough to follow Aaron's movements. Draxil roared, the sound carrying pain and rage and disbelief in equal measure. He tried to grab Iran with his bare hands, tried to use his massive strength advantage to simply crush the boy. But Iran was no longer where the Draskar expected him to be. Move like water, his grandfather had said. Don't be where the enemy thinks you are. Don't be where you were a moment ago. Flow around their strength like water flows around stone. Strike at weakness like water finds every crack and gap. The blade found the knee joint of Draxil's armor, the flexible material that had to exist to allow the leg to bend. It cut through the composite in a single clean stroke, not a deep cut, not meant to sever the leg, but just to compromise the structural integrity enough to matter. Draxil's leg buckled under his own weight. He tried to compensate, tried to use his armor's powered systems to maintain position, but his destabilized gyroscope couldn't provide the corrections his balance systems were demanding. He went down on one knee with a crash that shook the platform, and Iran was already behind him, already moving to the next position, already placing the blade at the back of Draxil's neck, where armor met flesh in a vulnerable seam that had to exist for the wearer to be able to put the armor on and take it off. Enough! Narrow's voice shook the hall with force that was almost physical, with power that made the air itself vibrate. The entity's form blazed so brightly that many beings throughout the hall had to shield their various sensory organs or risk damage. Light poured from Narrow in waves that seemed to carry meaning beyond just illumination, that spoke to forces and capabilities that transcended mere technology. Cease this combat immediately. Both of you, stand down now. Aaron stopped with the blade hovering a hair's breadth from Draxil's neck, close enough that the Draskar could feel its presence, could feel how close he had come to death, could understand how completely he had been beaten. His chest heaved with exertion in the after effects of adrenaline, his muscles trembling with the strain of the fight. But his hand was steady. The blade didn't waver, didn't shake, remained as controlled now as it had been throughout the engagement. Below him, Draxil knelt with his weapon systems disabled, his armor offline or damaged beyond immediate function, his pride shattered more completely than any physical defeat could have accomplished. The commander's bioluminescent veins pulsed with colors that had no human emotional equivalent, shame and fury, and a kind of existential horror all mixed together, cycling through patterns that became more chaotic with each repetition. His three eyes stared at nothing, seeing something internal that Aaron couldn't imagine. His massive hands hung limp at his sides, servos whining as they tried to process commands that his brain wasn't sending properly. He had been beaten, utterly and completely beaten, by the very being he had mocked as primitive and worthless. His world, his identity, everything that defined him had ended in the space of seconds. Aaron stepped back, lowering the blade with the same care and deliberation he would have used if this had been a training exercise in his grandfather's workshop. His entire body shook with reaction to what had just happened, with the come-down from combat adrenaline, with the delayed fear that he had suppressed during the fight. But he forced himself to move smoothly, forced himself to sheathe the weapon with the same respect and care his grandfather had taught him to show always, regardless of circumstances. A blade was not to be disrespected, not to be treated as just a tool, no matter what horrors it had just prevented or what violence it had just performed. It deserved acknowledgement of what it was and what it represented. He turned away from Draxil, dismissing the fallen warrior as no longer a threat, and ran to Mira. She lay crumpled on the platform in a position that looked wrong, that spoke to bones broken and organs damaged. Her skin had gone pale, gray-tinged in a way that suggested shock and blood loss. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, each breath accompanied by sounds that suggested fluid in her lungs. But she was breathing, and that meant she was alive, and that meant there was hope. Medical teams were rushing toward them now, multi-species units equipped to handle the wildly different biological requirements of the conglomerate's member races. But in that moment before they arrived, before the professionals took over, Mira's eyes opened. They were glassy with pain that must have been agonizing, unfocused in ways that suggested serious neural disruption, but they managed to fix on Aaron's face with enough recognition to matter. "Did you?" She managed to whisper, her voice barely audible, each word clearly costing her enormous effort. "We won," Aaron said, his own voice breaking despite his efforts to keep it steady. "We won. You saved me. You saved all of us. Now let them save you." A smile touched her lips, small and pained, but genuine. Her eyes closed again as the medical team arrived and began their work, deploying equipment and medications and technologies that Iran couldn't identify. They were efficient and professional, working with the kind of calm competence that suggested they had handled traumas like this before, that they knew what they were doing. One of them, something vaguely insectoid with multiple manipulator arms, looked up at Iran with compound eyes that reflected light in strange patterns. "She will live," it said through a translation device. "The damage is severe, but not beyond our capabilities to repair. She will require extensive treatment and recovery time, but she will survive this." Aaron nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and stepped back to let them work. His legs felt weak suddenly, as if all the strength had drained out of them now that the immediate crisis had passed. He wanted to collapse, wanted to sit down and shake and maybe cry, wanted to process everything that had just happened. But he remained standing, remained present, because this wasn't over yet, and he needed to see it through to the end. Neril descended from above, the entity's presence commanding absolute attention, despite the chaos still resolving itself throughout the hall. Security forces had finally arrived to secure Draxil, surrounding the fallen commander with weapons drawn and restraint fields active. The observation galleries were in uproar as species debated and argued about what they had witnessed. But when Neril spoke, every voice fell silent. Every being turned their attention to the council head. "Draskar," Neril said, and the word carried weight like a collapsing star, like gravity made audible. "You have violated the most sacred protocols of this hall. You have attacked a petitioner during formal evaluation proceedings. You have placed personal pride above the law that you swore to uphold. You have attempted murder before witnesses from every major species in the conglomerate. You have demonstrated not strength, but weakness, the weakness of one who cannot accept being proven wrong, who cannot acknowledge that superiority is not a birthright, but must be earned and maintained through honor." Draxil tried to speak, tried to offer some defense or justification, but Neril continued without pause, cutting off any attempt at explanation. "Your species has held positions of military authority within the conglomerate for 3 centuries. You have served with honor in numerous conflicts. You have protected member species and advanced the cause of peace and stability. But honor is not a shield against consequences. Service does not excuse criminality. Effective immediately, Commander Draxil Wren is removed from all positions of authority and remanded to Draskar Justice for Judgment according to your own laws. The Draskar species as a whole are removed from all military command positions pending a full review of this incident and a determination of whether your culture's obsession with dominance has compromised your ability to serve the conglomerate's interests. You will be restricted from council proceedings until such time as you can demonstrate that one commander's actions do not reflect your species' fundamental character. Your authority here is ended." The words fell like hammer blows, each one striking with finality that left no room for appeal or negotiation. In the observation galleries, Draskar representatives roared in protest, their bioluminescent veins blazing with colors that spoke to rage and humiliation. But security systems locked them in place, preventing any further violence, enforcing order through force since reason had failed. Draxil himself said nothing, remaining on his knees with his head bowed, his veins pulsing with colors that cycled too fast to track, too chaotic to interpret. His world had ended. The thing that defined him, that gave his life meaning and purpose. Power, respect, the fear he inspired in others. All of it was gone, destroyed in a matter of minutes by a child with a sword. Neril turned to Aaron, and the entity's form was difficult to read as always. But there was something in its posture that might have been respect or might have been something more complex that human emotional frameworks couldn't quite capture. Humanity, Neril said, and the hall's translation systems carried the word to every being present in hundreds of languages, ensuring that no one missed the significance of this moment. You have demonstrated something we thought impossible. You have shown that advancement is not measured only in technology, that strength is not found only in power, that worth is not proven only through dominance and force. The entity paused, and lights flickered through its form in patterns that seemed almost thoughtful, almost uncertain in ways that suggested Neril was choosing words with unusual care. You came before us carrying the memory of your past, unwilling to discard your history in exchange for acceptance. You refused to pretend to be something you are not. You faced impossible odds with tools that should have been inadequate, that every rational analysis said could not succeed. You met violence with precision and control, met arrogance with dignity and restraint, met death with sacrifice, that asked nothing in return. These are qualities the conglomerate was founded to protect and promote. These are qualities we had begun to forget in our certainty and our comfort, in our assumption that technological sophistication was the only measure of civilization that mattered. Neril's voice grew stronger, resonating through the hall in ways that made it seem less like sound and more like fundamental vibration of reality itself. I declare the human petition approved without reservation or limitation. Humanity is accepted into the dawning planet's conglomerate with full membership rights and all accompanying protections. You will be granted access to our trade networks, our defensive alliances, our accumulated knowledge. Furthermore, the Council formally recognizes the human practice of honoring lineage and craft as a valuable contribution to our collective cultural wealth, something to be preserved and studied rather than dismissed as primitive. Let it be recorded in our permanent archives that we were reminded today of truths we had let slip away in our rush toward ever greater complexity, that every civilization, no matter how small or technologically limited, carries something unique and valuable, that dismissing the old ways can blind us to wisdom that predates our science, that a blade forged by hand with dedication and skill can accomplish things that machines and computation cannot replicate, that there are forms of strength that our instruments cannot measure, but that prove themselves through action and sacrifice. The hall erupted in response, though the reaction was far from uniform. Some species cheered, their various sounds creating a cacophony of approval that ranged from subsonic rumbles to ultrasonic shrieks. Others remained silent, processing the implications of what had just happened, considering how this precedent might affect their own positions within the conglomerate. A few protested openly, arguing that precedent was being violated, that exceptions would lead to chaos, that standards had to be maintained or the entire structure would collapse. But Neril had spoken with the full authority of the Council, and every being present had witnessed the events that led to this decision. The ruling would stand regardless of objections, would become part of the conglomerate's permanent record, would shape policy and perception for generations to come. Aran barely heard any of it, barely processed the sounds of celebration and protest that filled the hall. He knelt beside Mira as medical personnel worked on her with instruments and medications and techniques that looked more like magic than medicine to his untrained eyes. They had stabilized her condition, stopped the immediate life-threatening processes, begun the long work of repairing damage that would have killed her within minutes without intervention. She would live. That much the medics had confirmed with certainty, but she would be in recovery for weeks at minimum, possibly months depending on how well her body responded to treatments designed for alien physiologies and adapted for human biology. "You did it," she whispered when consciousness returned briefly, her voice stronger than before, though still weak, still colored by pain that the medications could only partially suppress. "You actually did it. You saved us all." "We did it together," Aaron corrected, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "You saved me when I couldn't save myself. You gave me the chance to finish what we started. None of this would have happened without you believing it could. Your grandfather would be so proud." Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, whether from pain or emotion, or both, he couldn't tell. "He would be so incredibly proud of who you've become." Aaron felt his own tears threatening, felt the emotions he had been suppressing throughout this entire ordeal, trying to break free. But he blinked them back, swallowed them down, because this wasn't the time. His grandfather had taught him that tears were nothing to be ashamed of, that showing emotion was a strength, not a weakness. But that timing mattered. There would be time for grief and relief and processing everything that had happened. Right now, he needed to be strong for both of them. Needed to be the rock that Mira could lean on while she healed. "He is proud," Iran said with certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic. "I can feel it. Wherever he is, whatever comes after this life, he knows what we accomplished here. He knows his teachings mattered, that his craft mattered, that everything he sacrificed for wasn't wasted." They took Mira away on a hovering medical platform, surrounded by machines and specialists, headed for treatment facilities that could provide care beyond anything available on human worlds. Iran wanted to follow, wanted to stay with her through whatever came next. But Narel's presence drew his attention before he could move. The entity hovered nearby, waiting with patience that suggested time meant something different to beings like it. "You fought well," Narel said simply. "Better than anyone anticipated, including myself. You demonstrated skills and restraint that many beings with decades more experience could not match." "I fought like my grandfather taught me," Aaron replied, his voice steady again now that the immediate crisis had passed. "He said that fighting wasn't about winning, wasn't about proving you were stronger or better. He said fighting was about surviving long enough to learn why the fight mattered in the first place, about finding the path through conflict that preserved what was worth preserving." Wise words from a wise teacher. Narel's form pulsed with something that might have been approval. "There will be formalities, of course, treaties to sign, protocols to establish, systems to integrate. The bureaucratic machinery of the conglomerate moves slowly and requires enormous amounts of documentation. But the hard part is done. The impossible part is accomplished. Humanity has earned its place among the stars through your actions and your courage." Aaron looked at the blade still in his hand, still sheathed now, unmarked by the violence it had been part of, because he had fought to disable rather than kill, had followed his grandfather's teachings even in the moment of greatest danger. What happens to Draxil now? What will his people do to him? That is for the Draskar to decide according to their own laws and customs, Narel replied. But he has lost everything that gave his life meaning. His honor is destroyed. His position is ended. His future holds nothing but shame and the knowledge that he was bested by someone he had considered beneath notice. Perhaps in time he will learn from this experience. Perhaps this will be the beginning of wisdom for him, or perhaps he will remain broken by his failure to accept that he was wrong. That is his path to walk, not ours to determine. Narel began to drift away, the audience clearly at an end, but then paused and turned back. "One more thing, Aaron Weir. You spoke of your grandfather's wisdom, of the lessons he passed to you through his teaching and his example. The conglomerate would be honored if you would consider sharing those teachings more broadly. There are many species here who have lost their connection to their own histories, who have forgotten what their ancestors knew, who have sacrificed traditional knowledge in the rush to adopt the latest technologies. Perhaps you could help us remember. Perhaps you could teach us that old does not mean obsolete, that tradition carries wisdom that innovation alone cannot replace." "I'm just a kid," Aaron protested, the weight of what Narel was suggesting pressing down on him. "I'm 13 years old. I don't know if I can teach anyone anything meaningful. I'm still learning myself." "You just taught an entire assembly of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations that they had become arrogant," Narel pointed out, with something that might have been amusement in its voice. "You showed them that their assumptions about strength and worth and civilization were incomplete. You reminded us that we had forgotten important truths in our certainty, that we had surpassed the need for them. I think you have more wisdom than you realize, more to offer than you understand. But that is a conversation for another time. For now, rest, recover, process what has happened. The conglomerate will still be here when you're ready." The entity departed, leaving Iran alone on the platform that had become the stage for humanity's judgment. Around him, the hall was slowly emptying as species returned to their sectors, their worlds, their lives that had been briefly interrupted by this drama. The story of what had happened here would spread at the speed of light and thought, would be transmitted across the conglomerate's communication networks, would be told and retold, with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. The human boy who faced down a Draskar warrior with nothing but an antique sword, the species that earned respect through craft and honor rather than firepower and intimidation. The reminder that civilization was measured in more than technology. But for Aaron, standing there in the emptying hall, with his grandfather's blade at his side and Mira's blood still visible on the platform, it was simpler and more personal than that. He had done what needed to be done. He had honored his grandfather's memory and teachings. He had protected his people to the best of his ability. And somehow, impossibly, he had survived when every logical analysis said he should have failed or died or both. He looked up through the transparent ceiling at the plasma clouds and distant stars, at the vast universe that humanity had struggled so hard to reach and join. Earth was out there somewhere, billions of kilometers away, its blue-green beauty hidden by distance, but no less real for being unseen. The scattered human colonies were out there on their marginal worlds, struggling and surviving, waiting to hear the news that would change everything for them. They were no longer alone, no longer unprotected, no longer at the mercy of an uncaring universe that seemed designed to crush them. Aran closed his eyes and let himself remember the workshop on Hymar one more time. The heat of the forge warming his face, the ring of the hammer striking steel in perfect rhythm, his grandfather's patient voice explaining mysteries that took lifetimes to master. All of that had led to this moment. Every lesson, every long night of practice, every time he had wanted to quit but hadn't, every drop of sweat and moment of doubt, an hour of grinding repetition, all of it had purpose now. All of it had been worth the cost. "I did it, grandfather," he whispered to the empty air, to the memory of a man who had believed in him when no one else did. "We did it together, you and me. We showed them that we matter, that our history and our traditions and our refusal to quit mean something. We're going to be okay now. Humanity's going to survive and maybe even thrive. Your teachings will continue. The craft will be passed on. You didn't work in vain." The blade at his side seemed to warm in response, as if the metal itself was alive and listening, as if his grandfather's spirit really did inhabit the weapon he had crafted with such love and dedication and skill. Maybe it did. Maybe the old man's essence had been bound into the steel through all those hours of work and belief. Or maybe it was just good steel, properly forged according to techniques refined over generations, wielded by someone who believed in it absolutely and trusted it completely. In the end, Aaron thought, did it matter which explanation was true? The blade had cut when it needed to cut. That was all that mattered. That was enough. He turned and walked toward the exit where human diplomats were waiting, their faces showing mixtures of shock and joy and relief and disbelief. They would want to celebrate, to plan, to begin the complex process of integrating humanity into the conglomerate's structures and systems. There would be meetings that lasted for days, treaties that took months to negotiate, cultural exchanges that would reshape both humanity and the species they would now work alongside. There would be challenges ahead, new threats to face, new lessons to learn, new mistakes to make and recover from. But tonight, for this one moment, humanity could rest easy. They had earned their place among the stars. They had proven their worth. And they had done it not by abandoning who they were, not by pretending to be something they weren't, but by embracing their identity completely. By showing that human stubbornness and human creativity and human refusal to accept defeat had value that couldn't be measured in technological specifications or military capability. Iran took one last look at the split mannequin, still lying where it had fallen, still testament to the impossible made possible. Maintenance crews would clean it up eventually, would analyze the cut with instruments and theories, would write reports about how something that shouldn't have worked had worked anyway. Let them try. Science was valuable and necessary and worthwhile. But some things transcended equations and measurements. Some things could only be understood by doing rather than theorizing, by believing rather than calculating, by putting your whole self into a single moment and trusting that preparation and purpose and refusal to quit would be enough. His grandfather had understood that truth, had lived it every day of his life, had embodied it in everything he created and taught. And now, in a hall full of advanced aliens who had forgotten such simple and fundamental truths, a 13-year-old boy had reminded them all that technology alone didn't make a civilization great. Character made civilizations great. Honor and sacrifice and the willingness to stand firm when everything seemed lost made them great. The courage to keep swinging the hammer even when the metal refused to shape, to keep trying even when logic said you should quit. Aaron Weir walked out of the grand hall with his head high and his grandfather's blade at his side, carrying the future of humanity on shoulders that shouldn't have been strong enough to bear that weight, but had proven they were. Behind him, the stars watched through the transparent ceiling, and if they noticed one small species taking its first real steps into their light, they gave no sign. But they would notice soon enough. They would all notice. Because humanity had arrived among the stars, and they were not going quietly into anyone's galaxy. They would be heard. They would be respected. They would make their mark on the universe not through conquest or domination, but through the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had brought them this far. Through the belief that every individual mattered, that every tradition carried wisdom, that every challenge was just another problem waiting for someone clever enough and determined enough to solve it. The blade at his side had shown them the way. Now it was up to humanity to follow that path wherever it led, to honor the memory of all those who had sacrificed to bring them to this moment, to build something worthy of the chance they had been given. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. But they would do it anyway, because that was what humans did. They endured. They adapted. They refused to quit. And sometimes, when circumstances demanded it, they reminded the universe that old ways and simple tools and human determination could still change the course of history.